In this presentation, I'll talk to you about possessives and the use of apostrophes. Most of the time, we use apostrophes to show possession. Now, there are a few exceptions to this rule, but in general, we use apostrophes to show possession or ownership. For example, Jen found Keisha's wallet under the front seat of the car. Pretty straightforward. But possession also means something of something else. So it isn't always a person who owns something. It can mean tomorrow's lecture. He deserves a day's pay for a day's work. There are, of course, always these exceptions. We use apostrophes to form the plurals of letters, numbers, symbols, and words used as words. So, for example, a dyslexic individual often confuses B's and D's. A social security number has 5 sixes in it. You should not use ands in formal writing. Be careful about using too many ands in a sentence. But in general, don't use an apostrophe when making an uppercase letter plural. She graduated with straight A's. The difference is that it's more obvious that you're making a letter plural, but make sure that if not having an apostrophe creates confusion, that you do add one in. So it's sort of a matter of judgment at those times. So you can see that in this first example, A's in science are hard to come by. Immediately you'd look at that and think as, and then you'd read the sentence and then you'd be, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. I don't get that. And then you'd have to figure it out. What we're trying to do as writers is always to create the least amount of confusion. We want reading to be seamless. So instead, in that case, we'd add the apostrophe after the capital A. The other exception is in organization or corporations' names or titles. So we always go with the organization's preference. So for example, a Tim Hortons shop, there's no apostrophe there. So how do we know? Well, for me, if I'm faced with something like this as an editor, I always just go to the organization's homepage and see what they do. You can also look it up in the Canadian Press's Caps and Spelling Guide. It's a really handy little guide. They have a lot of common corporation names, particularly for Canada. They don't have everything though, so when in doubt, go to the source. That's what I like to do. Apostrophes can also be used for contractions. So cannot becomes can't, they are becomes there, does not become doesn't, and it can be used for dates. So if we're abbreviating a date, we can use the apostrophe to show that something's missing. So I hope that you'll find this table useful. It lays out precisely when to add an S or an apostrophe, where to put the apostrophe, depending upon whether the possessive noun is singular or plural, and whether it already ends in an S or doesn't. All these variations can be a little bit confusing, but there is a logic that goes with it. So go through this table on your own, take a look at it. I did check with the Canadian Press Style Guide, and they do accept either the apostrophe S or just the apostrophe after a singular possessive noun that already ends in S. That's one of those ones that's a little bit weird to me. I like to just use the apostrophe, but depending upon perhaps an in-house style guide that you might be following, they might have a particular preference. Most of the time, you're probably going to be using the Canadian Press style book, but always check with whatever guides you're using. Sometimes you might find that you're using a combination of guides and defaulting to one or the other. Compounds can add another level of complexity to figuring out possession and where to put an S or an S and an apostrophe. I'll go through the first couple examples for you because you are likely to run into this. The last two examples you're less likely to run into, but take a look at them anyway and know that you can come back and look at this chart at another time when you need to. Uh, so when we have two people that own something or are doing something together, so for example, say two people own a house, or three people own a house for that matter, the same rules apply. Um, or maybe two people or three people or four people are going on an adventure and you're listing their names. Also in the case of the second example that I've got in that final column, Kim and Kai's wedding. So we have two people who are equally as engaged and equally uh, have equal ownership of this wedding. So in these kinds of examples, you will just put the apostrophe S on the end of the final proper noun. But when we have more than one person engaging in something, but they're doing it separately. So let's say that we've got Ray and we've got Scott, and Ray lives over in this house and Scott lives over in this house. And they each have their own video games. We're talking collectively about both their video games, but half the video games actually belong to Ray and half the video games belong to Scott. Then we would put the apostrophe S at the end of both their names. And the same goes for if we have two individuals or five individuals who each have their own homes, then we would put the apostrophe S or the apostrophe after an S in this case for each of their names. It does get a little complicated when you're talking about compound words of various types, but I think sometimes as writers or as editors, one of the best things we can do is know where to find information. And so look through these examples, understand what's going on in these examples, but then know that if you're confused by this, you can always come back to this chart. So let's just look at a few more examples and exceptions that might confuse people. Do not use an apostrophe to form the possessives of personal pronouns. So personal pronouns are those pronouns that we're probably most familiar with. Um, Her or our. So hers and ours, theirs. We do not add that apostrophe before the S. We just put the S on the end of the pronoun. Do not use an apostrophe in the word its if you mean belonging to it. Its means it is or it has. So it apostrophe S is a contraction. It's without an apostrophe is the possessive. It's just an exception because one of those words had to have an apostrophe, so it's the contraction. Here's a kind of an odd exception, but it's definitely something that you could run into. Don't make titles possessive. So in the first example there, reunion's setting is New York City. Just recast the sentence. So in a way, what is happening with that first example is adding the apostrophe S is changing the title. So that's the problem there. Instead, just recast the setting or the sentence. The setting of reunion is New York City, and that works just as well.